Thank you so much for that really nice introduction, Michelle. This is great, and I'm really excited about this presentation. I can tell already you have a spirited and hilarious group, and I'm very excited to get to know your members. And it's great to see so many people attending this webinar today. We have a few webinar goals. We're hoping to provide your audiences with examples of decarbonization options at different scales. We're going to offer some perspectives on decarbonization pathways, technologies, and trends. And we have plenty of time to answer your questions. To walk us through this webinar roadmap, we're going to do a couple of introductions, although you already introduced us a little bit. Just do it again. We're going to share a set of decarbonization stories. And then if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about getting buy-in and raising funds, because I have a feeling this group is really interested in organizing and galvanizing your efforts so that you can get stuff accomplished. And then, of course, there's time for Q&A. I'll have Chris introduce himself first, again.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, first, just also want to say really great to be here. Excited to talk with you all, and it's great to see so many of you here to join and listen to us. So thank you. As mentioned, I'm Chris Lewis, Vice President of Engineering with GreenerU. I've been here at the company since 2012, and look forward to talking with you more about some of the case studies and examples that we have today, and then hopefully have some time to answer questions that you all may have.
Yeah, and I'm Jen Haugh. I usually just go by Jen. And I'm the Vice President of Planning and Customer Engagement with GreenerU. I have been with GreenerU since 2017, so it's going on actually 8 years. On Saturday will be my 8-year anniversary. So
Congratulations.
I are big fans of GreenerU, and we love working here.
So we'll just to say a little bit more about GreenerU and what we do. Pretty much wherever you are in your decarbonization journey, we're here to help. So we offer a range of services in three categories that we talk about: planning, engineering, and construction. So we can work with you sort of in early stages to develop plans, bring groups of people together to set goals and targets, and formulate those plans and provide consulting services there. And then we also can move into the engineering and design of specific decarbonization solutions, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And we are also a construction management firm, so we actually see the projects through to the implementation phase and help you get projects implemented and constructed with our operations group as well. So we kind of run the whole process from soup to nuts, and wherever you are in that process, there's probably something we can do to help you out.
We're going to start with some decarbonization stories, starting with the simplest, which is like decarbonizing a house, but then move into the most complex. But to start with that, we're going to talk about what do we mean by decarbonization? Because I think there are different meanings. So I'm going to turn this back to Chris.
When we talk about carbon emissions, that can mean a few different things, but you may hear this framework talking about scopes of emissions. So we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 is the green arrow right in the middle of the screen, and that's really for an organization talking about the direct emissions that go physically from that organization up into the atmosphere. So that's coming from really the buildings and vehicles, and also maybe even cows. But that's scope 1 emissions, so direct from the facility. And then we have scope 2, which is the sort of the gray circular arrow in the background on the left side there. And there's only one little icon associated with it, but it's a really important one, and that is purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. So that would be energy sources that are purchased and brought into the facility. So mainly we're talking about electricity. And there would be some emissions associated with generating that electricity and getting it to your facility. So that's scope 2. It's not, the emissions don't necessarily happen directly at the facility, but they're directly associated with that purchased energy. So we focus a lot on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. There's also a whole bunch of stuff going on with these other sort of purplish arrows on either side, upstream and downstream. of the facility or the organization. This is called scope 3. There's all different kinds of categories, as you can see, ranging from transportation to materials, to travel, purchased goods, even investments. So those are all considered scope 3. They're somewhat indirect from the organization's operations, but they are associated with it. So usually the way to think of it is that your scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 or 2. So just wanted to lay out that framework. We're going to probably talk mostly about scope 1 and 2 today, which is where a lot of our focus of some of our project work is, but there's a lot of interesting things going on in scope 3. And so happy to talk about that at the end as well. So that's what carbon emissions, how we kind of think about the different types and different sources. So now we can talk more, what do we mean by decarbonizing? So just to think a little further about when we want to set out to decarbonize, how can we do that across the different scopes, 1, 2, and 3? So for scope 1, again, that's sort of like buildings and vehicles. And so some of the key strategies there are converting heating systems from direct fossil fuel based and emissions producing type of equipment to electric. And I'm sure you've all heard a lot about electrification of systems and why that's such an important strategy for decarbonizing. Then we have things like zero carbon vehicles, and then other just general improvements in efficiency, lowering the amount of energy used in the first place in a facility can help reduce scope 1. And then scope 2, kind of pairing with that electrification, we also need to make sure that the emissions underlying that electricity are also low carbon or no carbon, so renewables such as solar. And this can be done through a variety of different either renewable energy projects an organization participates in directly or through different kinds of purchasing arrangements. But getting your scope 2 sources to be low or no carbon is kind of step 2. And then for scope 3, there's all kinds of different strategies associated with the different categories of scope 3 emissions, from looking at things like commuting and travel and air travel for organization members and trying to minimize that, or commuters who kind of come back and forth to a campus or to a facility, and the kinds of materials that are purchased. So a whole lot that goes on with scope 3, as I mentioned before.
All right, so a really simple form of decarbonization is a house, and that's my house. I'm actually sitting right here, up here. When I bought this house 5 years ago, it was running on oil heat, so that was a scope 2 emission. I have a gas-powered vehicle, which is, I don't know, you could call that my fleet. So that's also that's a scope 2, the scope 1 emission. Sorry, the first one was a scope 1 emission. Sorry, thank you, Chris. The yeah, the house didn't have any air conditioning, and the hot water was powered by that oil heat as well. And so, it's gonna try and decarbonize my household. So the first thing I did was I installed air source heat pumps, which are electric, and that includes mini splits. You can actually see on the side of the house, you've got the mini split drain pipe there. And I bought an electric vehicle, and then I installed a level 2 charger on my house. I also went for an solar assisted water heat pump system. And eventually I would like, because my electric bills spiked, I would like to put solar panels on my rooftop. So that's really simple. But when we talk about decarbonizing an institution, it's kind of a bigger deal. There's a lot more people involved. There's a lot more stakeholders who need to be engaged in that process. And then, so this is Historic New England, which owns 39 properties throughout New England. The thing about Historic New England is they, of course, they have lots of historic buildings, and they all have kind of different operations. there's like different considerations that need to go into developing a decarbonized property. So it's interesting because a lot of their properties date back 200 or 300 years or more, but they are considering kind of their phrase is like what's old is new again. So they're interested in decarbonizing their properties in a way that preserves that historic representation. So, Historic New England actually created a set of goals that cover resilience, mitigation, and climate justice. And the institution created these goals with the interest in mind of also sharing this information with other types of historic preservation institutions. And so one of their first steps was to create a pilot project, first at Casey Farm, which was this property. Casey Farm is located in Saunderstown, Rhode Island. It's an active farm. They do community supported agriculture, so they've got people coming and going. They've got animals, so they're including those animals in their Scope 1 emissions. Um, they are also operating a farmers market in the summertime, and so it's a very active and interesting farm site. They've got some greenhouses, they've got a barn building, and then they've got a main house there. So the first thing we did with them was baselining. And by baselining, what I mean is we did a measurement of all of their scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions that they wanted to track. We measured scope 1 emissions by taking account of their utility bills, and same for scope 2, their electricity bills. We also included how many animals they had. We looked at their fleet, which includes farm equipment. Um, and then on this third thing here, which I think my phone or my computer thought was a map of Alaska or something. It's actually the counties that or the towns that surround the Casey Farm property, and this was a survey of how people were getting to the farm, and that is considered a Scope 3 emission. So that was sort of a determination of just how many miles people were driving, and we estimated what that translated into in terms of emissions. So we use that information to create goals. And the goal setting process was done through 2 main meetings. Generally, with a college campus, we'll go through 5 meetings. But because this effort was a bit smaller and the stakeholders were not necessarily all, on campus, but represented different parts of the historic New England staffing and volunteers and such, we were able to abbreviate that process a little bit. So we had 2 main meetings that involved a lot of sticky notes, a lot of ideas, a lot of revisions, and between those meetings behind the scenes, we did some revisions with staff. So then by the time we got all done, and that this was, lots of iterations and revisions, we created a plan. And it looks something like this. And that included, as I mentioned, mitigation, resilience, and climate justice. So then with the next steps, we're looking at what is it going to take to implement some of those plans. So I'll have Chris go through the next phase.
As Jen pointed out, one of the key things here was to bring everyone together and have alignment on what the objectives really were. And so once there was buy-in for that plan, that allowed them to proceed into kind of rolling up sleeves and really starting to get to work on some of these decarbonization strategies. So what we're doing now is entering into an engineering phase at Casey Farm to further develop the concepts for some of these decarbonization strategies, including upgrading lighting to LED to reduce electricity consumption, converting some of the heating systems from fuel to heat pumps. They want to look at the use of a solar and electric battery type system to power their irrigation pump, which currently runs on diesel. And then look into are there opportunities for on-site renewable power generation, such as like solar, ground-mounted solar, or something along those lines. there may be some opportunities to weatherize, improve the insulation of their buildings. Now, these are historic buildings, as we know, and in fact, one of the other properties we've looked at with them, part of what they're exhibiting, to visitors to the house is the historic techniques for insulating the wood paneling of the walls. So we're not going to go in there and start, putting spray foam all over everything. So it's a little bit of a special case here, but they do want to see if there's opportunities to improve the insulation value. And then they have some other needs as well, which is improving the climate control for some of the spaces where they keep collections or they keep special objects as part of their operations as a museum. So I guess that one's notable just in that a lot of times, there may be an initial focus on these decarbonizing strategies, but inevitably there are lots of other benefits and improvements to a facility that can come along with these projects, such as improved lighting, better comfort, better control. The climate control system was a really key feature for them too. So what our team is doing is going in and reviewing all these different strategies, developing designs and engineering for these potential projects and helping them come up with costs and scopes. And then they can move into the construction planning with the projects that they choose to go ahead with and start making progress toward their goals.
And then the last story we're going to talk to you about is UMass Chan Medical School. Do you want to kind of give an overview of this, Chris?
Yeah, so the UMass Chan Medical School is part of the University of Massachusetts system. So it's a medical teaching and research university with an associated active hospital and medical center right on its main campus in Worcester, Massachusetts. So it's a large facility, and as I said, they're part of the UMass system, and so are subject to not just the sort of the statewide goals for meeting carbon reductions, but also a specific leading by example target for certain state entities to kind of lead the way and meet certain reduction targets. And this is a big challenge for them because of the nature of their campus and the nature of the systems that they have there. And you can go to the next slide now, Jen. One of the big challenges is that, this is a 24-hour care facility. They have a full-fledged hospital connected right to their campus, which obviously operates all the time. You can't turn the lights out and can't shut the heating down. At any point, they have very stringent requirements for power resiliency, backup power, and so on. So that itself presents a very big challenge when thinking about what to do and how to reduce. These are also just very energy intensive buildings because of the nature of the facilities. Laboratories tend to have really high energy usage rates. That has to do with the ventilation systems, the amount of air ventilation that needs to be brought in, and how energy intensive it is to move and heat and cool that air all throughout these large buildings. They're very old. They're operated all the time, so it's difficult to go in and retrofit systems to a major extent within these buildings. And they've got just a lot of big buildings, a lot of square footage with very high energy intensity. Another kind of particular aspect of their baseline, and as we started working with them, one of the first things they needed to do was take a good hard look at their existing systems and what's their baseline emissions. And you won't normally see an emissions profile that looks quite like this, where as you can see from this chart, 98% of their energy usage and similar proportion of emissions is from natural gas, with only that small sliver being electricity. And the reason for that is that their main central power plant has power generation equipment that runs off natural gas. So they're making their own power. They're producing the heating, electricity, steam, and chilled water for cooling for the entire campus, almost entirely using fossil fuel source, which is natural gas. And all of that is happening right the center, the sort of the central heart of the energy system of the campus in their central plant, which makes it just a really big challenge to tackle because it's so concentrated and so critical to the entire operations.
The campus itself created goals in 2021, including they wanted to create a 20% energy use intensity, and that's EUI, reduction by 2026. They also wanted to decarbonize Scope 1 emissions. So again, that's their natural gas plant basically by 2035. So that's coming up in 10 years. And then, as Chris mentioned, they need to align with the Massachusetts goal to become net zero emissions by 2025. And that's per Executive Order 594, which is an update to Executive Order 484, but that's academic at this point. So understanding that they wanted to embark on something more than a climate action plan, but to go through a decarbonization planning process, which is a major endeavor that they did with both Arup Engineering, or just Arup, which is a major engineering firm, and then they used GreenerU to go through that process as an owner's rep so that they could align their options for decarbonization with their priorities on campus. So what they did with that is we kind of created an understanding, like a shared understanding. We had a lot of discussions about this. This is an example of a scoring system we used with some key people on campus to figure out what are your priorities and how can we weigh all of our options that are, you could come up with a bunch of technical solutions that are just not feasible at the end of the day, or you could create the technical solutions that align with those priorities. And so what they came up with is this, which in a graphic of a wheel, it's a little bit hard to read, but essentially we did it this way because we didn't want it to look like any one of these was a priority. Also, we didn't want to offend the state by listing the, support of the Commonwealth's decarbonization target and list that last. So it's just floating. But yeah, we wanted to make sure that these seven priorities were included in all of the solutions that we talked about. So we did a lot to get buy-in for this. We had an open house. We gave away cookies and coffee. Um, we had we had a Green Lab Summit, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Chris and a couple of others presented in a webinar series, which were pretty fantastic. It included like a discussion of what would hydrogen and other biofuels include. Chris talked about electrification. Is that the answer? UMass Chan is unique in that it is exploring what is micronuclear energy and how might that work on this campus. Um, the other thing that they were exploring was biofuels. So we had a guest speaker from Bates. Sorry, he's from Bates College. Bates College. So Bates College is using biofuels, and they are considered decarbonized as long as they're using those fuels. So we did all of this, and at the end of the day, they came up with kind of this solution. And Chris, you want to talk about this?
I know some of the text is probably too small to read on the slide, but just looking at the graph along the bottom, I mean, this is sort of the roadmap that was developed through this process, and I think that for every organization, they need to kind of think about what that curve looks like. What's that kind of glide path getting you from where you are now to the eventual goal of net zero, and how that could happen over time. And what's notable on this one is that there are certain strategies that happen in the more near term that make significant reduction in emissions, but then you'll also see this pretty significant and relatively sharp drop off that happens out, around the 2040 time frame, and that represents for them a major switch in their fuels. So what they recognized was that because of the makeup of their central plant and the configuration of those systems, it was going to be very difficult for them to just make to very quickly and in the near term make a sudden switch of the fuel source that powers really their entire their campus. But there were things that they could do in the meantime that would make meaningful reductions, such as energy conservation, on-site, renewables. There's also offsets mentioned here. But they wanted to have a vision for how this was going to play out, and at what point in time would they be ready to get themselves prepared to make that large switch in fuels from a fossil fuel, which currently primarily natural gas, to something else. And what that would give them was it's time to really fully explore and understand their options for what that something else would be. And as Jen mentioned, there was consideration given to renewable hydrogen or even micronuclear as a potential option. But they recognize that at the scale they're operating, those technologies are there right now, but they're not quite ready. They're not quite matured in the marketplace to the extent that they'd be able to adopt that immediately. So that's how this played out in terms of a roadmap, and I think it's an important lesson just in that when you're making your decarbonization plan, you want to have sort of both the long-term vision, but also some of the near-term actions that you can take to start moving in the right direction. And this was a great example of that.
All right, so the key takeaways from most of these projects are that first you need the data. So you want to get your baseline data. You want to understand what you're emitting right now. And that way you can kind of benchmark that against future efforts. You want to get the buy-in, and I've got some slides coming up that talk about the buy-in. Technical solutions are not the only consideration, and maybe Chris, you want to address that one?
The point there is that there's always an engineering solution for for any problem, but really the place to start is to make sure there's alignment within an organization to understand what the goals and the priorities are. So the example you gave, like at UMass Chan, of really drawing out all of the key priorities, values, and goals before even just developing the technical solution on its own without considering all those different inputs.
Yeah. And then similarly, like decision making is iterative. And what we mean by that is you may want to set a goal, but before really setting that goal, you might draft a goal and then you get some more information, technical information. You might like look at some of your energy efficiency options and some of your technical options, find out how much that costs, find out like what year you can actually implement that goal based on how much money you need to raise. And so, sometimes it changes over time, and that's okay. Um, Likewise, decarbonization can be gradual. You can, do a chunk at a time. You don't necessarily have to achieve all of it at the same time. And that goes along with the last point, which is, if you can't reach 100% right now, but you think realistically 85% is what you can afford in the next 25 years or 5 years or 10 years, that's okay too. Like it's better to do something than nothing. Getting buy-in and raising funds. And I'm going to open this up for discussion actually. I want to ask this group, why do you think stakeholder engagement is important to the process?
Well, one area is, we can't do anything uh, uh, without the support of our administrations at our individual communities. The members of SAFE, the SAFE community, can come up with all kinds of stuff that indicates ways in which to achieve net zero by 2050 or come close. But without the support and buy-in of number one, administration, and number two, the residents at our communities, it's not going to go anywhere. But if I do have another quick question I wanted to ask, everything you presented seemed to be New England based.
Mhm.
Do your services extend beyond New England?
Our consulting services do. Our construction services tend to focus on New England because we are, our feet are on the ground here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Along with, I guess, what one of the points of this slide is, have you ever been involved in a process or maybe what we're witnessing right now in the universe of the current administration is like when, what happens when stakeholders are not engaged?
Well,
It-
I'll barge in again. Just a simple example is, trying to convince management as we move to add new vehicles on site that's being used by facilities and other groups to use EV and paid a price, uh, which is more now than just going with a used gas-powered truck as an example. It's tough to get them thinking uh, long term, number one, not just from a financial standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the impact it has on our planet and our future generations. So that's a tough one.
Mhm. Any other thoughts?
We
Could I
should,
expand? I'd expand on what Joe was saying in saying that, as um, programs, as corporations, we face the issue all the time of dealing with the reality of what has to be done. In many cases, some of our campuses are 50 years old or 30 years old. We're all constantly dealing with the issues of maintaining them. Forget about energy reduction. Just think about just maintaining what has to be done and replacing worn out equipment, et cetera. And so, to Joel's point, getting management to think beyond next year in terms of what we're going to do and thinking about the kinds of investments that will change the character of the facility and make it more climate resilient is a tough issue.
Mhm. All right. So the planning process we engage in is lengthy, and I emphasize this because it just is more than just asking, just having one meeting. We end up having dozens of meetings. So after the baselining process, we go through a planning kickoff, we get community input, we go through focus area meeting, working group meetings, and it's extensive. To do this well, and this is what I want to impart to this group, is that we go through a stakeholder mapping process to ensure that we've got all of the perspectives represented who may influence the decision at the end. And basically we go through a vision to action process. We're trying to find, what is the inspirational desired state, big picture vision of the process, like what do you want to achieve at the very end? And that can be like the biggest ideas. And then we break it down into goals, strategies, and actions. We do this through, again, a lot of sticky note creation. And we rank them based on just how big of an idea is, like, why are we doing this? And then we get that down to a how. How are we going to do this? And we achieve a lot of this through using a tool called the scale of agreement, which is kind of great. Like you can vote on something with some caveats, and if there's not great consensus in that 1 or 2 range, we can get it to we can place things for discussion and then make revisions to language. I did want to touch on getting buy-in to raise funds. This is an example of a church that we've worked with where they're doing a capital campaign to raise funds for a ground source heat pump system. So they gave a presentation to their congregation about this ground source heat pump option versus air source heat pumps, and they were able to give all of the facts in advance and then get a vote from their community. They were also able to get some information about how willing is the congregation to raise funds for this. And as you I said that it was interesting because in the green lines, that's what this particular church's responses were. Like they were like less likely than the average, the benchmarking, to serve on a committee, but they were more likely to raise funds or contribute money. So it's interesting. So just briefly, historic New England, the reason I'm bringing this up is that doing their planning process really enabled them to fund their projects much better because everything they're doing is tied to an overarching plan. So they were able to talk about, stuff like capital improvements, including, they're replacing a roof. Well, that's kind of boring compared to advancing institutional resiliency goals. I think that's the end of my slide, so I am going to stop screen sharing and then we can get to all of the questions.